Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey, and with me today I have
Alex Carrick, chief economist, ConstructConnect for many years.
and
I'm Michael Guckes, senior economist. I've been here roughly 4.5 months, so it's a privilege to get to work with Alex, who, like he said, has been here a lot longer and has great experience in the industry.
And we're going to draw on both of your experience for this because everything we've heard is that we're heading towards a recession, both in the U.S. and Canada. And so I'm going to start with Alex, and I'm going to ask, what are the conditions for a recession? How are they similar and different in the U.S. and Canada, and what can we expect in the next few months?
Yeah, well, we seem to be determined to talk ourselves into a recession. And the word that is governing everything right now is inflation. And in the United States, the latest inflation number was 9.1% year over year. And that's got everybody freaked out.
Mm-hmm.
And it mainly centers on energy prices, and in particular gasoline, because gasoline is now 60% year over year. I would point out, though, that inflation, it's going to continue to be strong, but it's starting to moderate for some items, non-energy items, because there's a base effect that's in inflation. Like you compare the price this year versus the price last year, and the price last year was increasing. So if you look at some of the items that were really contributing to inflation, like the cost of used cars and trucks, that has come down versus what it was 3 months ago, come down considerably. And it's the same for things like hotel rooms and motel rooms and so on. So inflation is gradually going to ease, the number's going to ease. But in the meantime, interest rates are being raised dramatically, both in the United States and Canada. The differences between the two economies in terms of recession, I would say, would center on retail spending. In the US, retail spending got way above trend line. Like the economy bounced back very strongly. Mm-hmm. And so retail spending, if you chart it and you draw a trend line through it, it's way above trend line. Canada retail spending has improved with an improving economy, but it's not far off the trend line. So Canada's got a little bit more leeway there, and also foreign trade. The other one is foreign trade. The U.S. has a huge foreign trade deficit. Canada is starting to record some large foreign trade surpluses, and that's very good in terms of supporting GDP, because the net figure between exports and imports contributes directly to GDP's bottom line. And in the last month, Canada had the largest trade surplus because the price of oil is up and other commodities are up. So Canada's got a little bit of a cushion on the trade side, on the foreign trade side.
Okay, Michael, what's your take from the U.S.?
I think Alec is right on in a lot of regards. He did mention sentiment early on in his response. The latest sentiment reading from the U.S. was the lowest in recorded history at 50. It's unprecedented. Again, as Alec also very wisely pointed out, a lot of that has to do with this worry around inflation. Mm-hmm. I think the challenges that we will see in both countries they can both be explained in forms of supply and demand, right? And on the labor side, right, labor in Canada, the unemployment rate's 4.9%. I looked it up just recently here. In the U.S., it's similarly low or proportionately low compared to historical standards, respective historical standards for each country. So we're both nations are fighting this low employment situation. I can speak in the U.S. to the fact that the baby boomers have left the market more quickly than expected, than anticipated, largely as a result of COVID. We've seen the labor productivity, the labor force of those older age cohorts decline in a step fashion rather than as a sort of a slower transitional trend. And to backfill that is, younger workers, and the 16 to 24-year-old cohort, is doing what it can. But again, it's a function of numbers. If the baby boomer generation is larger than is leaving at a faster pace than the 16 to 24-year-olds can physically replace those positions. And that's to say nothing of the experience gap and the knowledge gap there, right? Somebody who's been working in an industry for many decades is obviously going to have more capability, more productivity for their employer and for the economy than someone who's new and coming into that same industry. So those are the challenges that I think we're seeing everywhere. And part of the solution to that we've talked about a little bit through our economics website is the need for training and education. And how do we make training and education more relevant to today's economy? Because I think there's a little bit of a disconnect that we've seen there that is going to hamstring both economies. It would hamstring any economy, really. So we need to figure out how we're going to get through this labor transition where we're losing a high number of very skilled workers and we're replacing them with just simply greener, younger workers. So we need to be thinking very much about that situation, and how we answer that question will certainly play out in the future for both countries' economies and their rebound, and what the next several years look like.
Okay, and just leading from the labor thing you're mentioning, does slowing down the economy, because they're definitely doing that even if we don't have a recession, they're trying to up interest rates to slow the economy down. Does that actually sort of help? Does that sort of let gas out of the engine a little bit, which maybe helps with the labor shortage? Or am I, I'm a layman, I'm not an economist, so maybe I'm completely wrong on this. Does that in any way help with the labor shortage problem?
Well, definitely it does. And in fact, that's actually a very interesting point, simply in terms of coloring what this recession is, because it's going to be a strange one. If we slip into recession, it's going to be a recession with the lowest unemployment rate on record, which is weird. I got a recession with unemployment about as low as it can go. So the whole question of labor shortage, the whole labor side is a big issue in terms of inflation, because wages have not, they've been increasing, and actually they're up a fair amount now. Like they're up, I don't know, 4% to 6%, depending on the measures that you read, maybe even higher, depending on whether you're talking about hourly or weekly. And in both economies. But the interesting point is, I think, that labor is discovering that it has more leverage than it's had in a long time. So a little bit of a slowdown in the economy might help in that respect, but I don't think it's really going to have that much of an impact. I think labor is going to start flexing its muscles, because we haven't really seen labor do anything on the employment side, on the contract negotiation side for a couple of decades, because there was globalization. And you knew that if you squawked in the marketplace, if you squawked to your employer, that your job could be outsourced someplace else in the world. And that's changing, because jobs are being brought home, and you're starting to see labor unrest. Like there's quite a number of instances where there have been contentious issues with workers, and it's about leverage. And I think labor has more leverage than it's had in the past, and I don't think that's something that's going to go away quickly. So if you're talking about inflation and whether inflation's got a long-term issue. That's one of them. It's going to be on the wage side. Commodity prices are coming down. The shortage situation is slowly being alleviated. Wages, maybe not so much. Maybe there isn't a lot of relief on that side.
And Michael, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Alex brought up a lot of great points. There's a thing called the solo growth model, fairly straightforward, and basically says, the economy is a function of your labor, your capital, and your technology. What we're seeing right now, and I think Alex pointed this out really well. I'm just going to describe it in a slightly different way, but the constraint we have right now is really not a function of the capital, it's a function of the labor. And as he pointed out, access to labor has gone through a few decades, or at least 2 decades at a minimum, of outsourcing. Being able to get labor from outside of Canada or North America, to put it more generally. So we've seen a little bit of a weaker employee position, right? And now with the supply and demand of labor fluctuating here, the way to maintain growth per, this growth model, which is just a basic growth model, is, we got to figure out more ways to engage labor. Well, to engage labor is going to cost you a little more because people's time is worth something to them. And they're going to want to maximize the value that they get for their time. So, in a lot of ways, Alex is absolutely right on. Now, it's a catch-22, of course, because the more that people charge for their labor, the more that the final output is going to cost for whatever they're producing, right? So if you're producing widgets, the classic economic production unit of all things is widgets, right? Because that's every academic's, example case. Well, if those widgets are costing 50% more in labor, right? That additional cost has to be covered in the price. And so the price of things goes up. And so there's a little bit of a catch-22. The more you pay the workers, the more the product that they produce is going to cost on the shelf, which then means that the person who's buying it, the real power of their wages is eroded a bit there. And so it is always a challenge there. Now, so having said that, the other part to it is, as was already mentioned, is the commodities. And we have seen a lot of commodities start to, I would say, normalize in their price, right? We've seen lumber change. There was an article we just put out about how the lumber market, even the futures contracts, will be changing a little bit here come August. And that might help to better normalize lumber prices. We've seen prices for copper come down. But then, of course, we now have this conflict in Ukraine. And so things like nickel, some of the agricultural commodities that are produced in Ukraine and exported abroad, whether it's grain, a final, food stuff, or if it's one of the fertilizer components, right? These things will all create some challenges moving forward. It's going to be very difficult to forecast, the price of these things moving forward, just because of the variability and the uncertainty that comes with war conflict, right? So the overall commodities picture, I think it's going to be good because there's a lot of macro reasons for it to normalize now. But of course, this conflict will throw a spanner into that picture that is just going to be so absolutely difficult to forecast. So I think that's a big part of what we're seeing, right? So we've covered there in your piece, the labor component, the commodities component. Warren, if I recall right, did you not start off this question asking about interest rates?
Well, I did say that they're bringing them up because they're trying to slow the economy down.
Yeah, one of the things I want to speak to that real quickly is the interest rate situation is very unique in this economic cycle right now. We, at least here in the US, for example, but countries, a lot of OECD countries worldwide, put a lot of money directly into consumers' pockets, right? I think the US did that on the order of about $6.5 trillion or so, depending on how you want to measure it. So they took $6.5 trillion, which is roughly, almost a third of annual GDP in this country, and put it into the pockets of companies through PPP. They put it into the hands of consumers through direct cash transfers, all of these things. And that created the inflation that we're seeing now. And in the US, the inflation, what's causing inflation, the major entities, commodities, products, right, that are seeing price rises. In the US, it's very diverse, more so than in a lot of other countries. I think a lot of that is because we bolstered demand with all this extra cash. Now, to raise interest rates in order to undo the inflation that was caused by those cash transfers is maybe solving the problem in a way that isn't necessarily helpful. And let me explain very briefly why I say that. Raising interest rates raises the cost of borrowing. And the classic economic thinking is that, well, if you raise interest rates, then businesses won't invest as much in new factories and other capital expenditures because it's simply more costly. The return on investment goes down, right? So what we've done is we've given consumers all this cash that has caused this surge in demand, and then we're going to undo that surge in demand by making it more expensive for businesses to invest. And it's like looking at a problem that is of one nature and trying to solve it with almost like the wrong tool in a sense, right? And this is, again, just from a classical economic perspective, right? Raising the cost of capital on firms to make investments now, to me, seems very precarious, right? Because we have all these supply chain issues. If we want to solve the supply chain problems that we're seeing now, if we want to, as Alex said, bring supply chains geographically closer to the consumer and closer to their final source of production, right? We're not going to be making hot tubs through these million-mile-long supply chains where we're getting a part from Asia, we're getting some parts from Europe, and we're bringing it all together in America or Canada for final assembly. You're going to need to invest in those upstream supply chains, those upstream products. But you're going to have to do that by creating new factories and new facilities here in North America. Well, to do that, but at a higher interest rate, all we're doing is we're making it more costly. And some of those investments simply won't be made at all because interest rates and the cost of capital is becoming more expensive. So, again, the problem is it's being solved in a way that I think is a little bit of an apples and oranges. And you can't compare the two fairly. You certainly can't just replace an apple with an orange, is maybe the best way to look at it this way, from the situation we have at hand here. So that's one of those tricky things about raising interest rates. And think about what it's done for the housing market. Alec and I both look carefully at the North American housing market, and we see what the median price of homes in Canada and the U.S. is, and it has shot up tremendously over the last several years. And so to raise interest rates now on a 30-year mortgage or any of the mortgage products that are available out there, it's going to have a huge ripple effect that could impact that market disproportionately to all the other stuff. It's one of those situations where we're trying to solve this big macro problem of too much inflation, and they're using this one particular tool on interest rates, but it has an outsized impact on certain industries, and housing will certainly be one of those. And that's where I think Alec and I are looking at this with a lot of concern, right? Because again, interest rate sensitive products like homes are going to be disproportionately impacted, and so the overall industry there will be disproportionately impacted as the Canadian Central Bank, as the Federal Reserve here in the U.S. tries to accomplish other goals.
I think you answered one of my upcoming questions already, which was what brought us into this situation. But Alec, I'd like to get your call on that. What besides what Michael already said, what brought us to the point we're at now?
Yeah, well, that's really kind of an interesting question because it's not really a typical recession in a lot of ways. It's the fact that the economy surged back so fast. That's part of it. they came back. They went down so far. There was a drop in activity that was so deep with the coronavirus, and then they really rebounded quickly, and a lot of money was spent by government. And at the time, I know that we all thought that that was really that did save the economy and so on. It was advisable at the time because it really was crisis conditions. There were layoffs everywhere, and nobody knew how to react to how sharply. And the economic textbooks are all going to have to be rewritten because there's going to be charts in them that you've never seen before, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
One of the fascinating things about the last 2.5 years that we don't think about is that this particular economic situation in early 2020 was driven by regulation, right? It wasn't that
Mm-hmm.
supply and demand got out of control. It was that the governments literally said, the service industry is basically going to be shut down until we can figure out what to do about this pandemic. And all of a sudden, people who worked at coffee shops and restaurants and a lot of other service industries places were essentially told, you're essentially without a job come tomorrow. And it was astonishing. I remember the day clearly because I was driving to work. It was March 17th, and I'm hearing on the radio, basically there won't be a job for a lot of service people come Monday or come Tuesday or whatever it was. My kids ended up being homeschooled that following week, and so the whole world had this hard shift, but it was regulatory driven, right? It wasn't like the Great Recession. It wasn't like the Great Depression. It was something just completely different in its nature, right? But it was tremendous in its impact too, as he pointed out. If we look at the unemployment rates charts, the unemployment rate chart in the year 2020 dwarfs every other shift in unemployment across the history of across recorded history, I should say. I mean, even the Great Depression, the unemployment chart there is almost like a minor blip compared to what we went through, which was, again, self-inflicted and consciously self-inflicted. So, that the way that we get through this recession, because of the nature of how it started, probably will look very different, and the economic textbooks will have to be rewritten because it's such a unique type of situation that we've gone through the last few years. All right, I've said more than enough. Alec, what do you think?
Well, the thing I was going to say is you can talk about inflation as being one thing, but the other thing is the world is just becoming more expensive, period. Inflation is one worry. The fact that everything is just becoming expensive, like even for companies, like if you're a company and you've got a fleet of cars, if you have to replace that fleet of cars with electric vehicles. Well, electric vehicles are more expensive than gas-powered vehicles. And all the big producers of aluminum and steel and cement, they've got to comply with green objectives now. So they've got to spend vast amounts of money changing their processes to cut down on carbon emissions. And that's money that's not being spent investing to expand capacity. And then every company has got to institute things like compliance courses and that sort of thing. And that's expensive. And the biggest of all maybe is you've got to invest in high tech. You can't function anymore unless you're making these major commitments to high tech. So inflation's one thing, expensive is another. Now, I would also say that a lot is going to depend in terms of how the economy unfolds as to how we get through this winter in terms of heating costs and so on in Europe. And we're gonna need some luck. It's going to have to be a warmer weather than usual in Europe, or there's going to be major dislocations because they have traditionally counted on Russian gas and cheap Russian gas to be able to heat their homes, a company like Germany and other countries. That is a potential real problem area. If the price of gas is just many times higher in Europe than it is in North America.
Yeah.
And we'll see how our European friends do.
The way to think about it too, as a business person, we talk about things as economists, but from the business perspective, right? There's what Alex is saying, what Alec is saying from a business perspective is that the sensitivity around energy efficient products is going to be much greater here coming into 2023 and potentially years beyond, right? As European countries and their consumers become vastly more sensitive to the price of energy and the products that consume energy. And so the question really becomes one for business owners everywhere is, how can I supply a shifting demand here? There's a change in the demand for energy efficient products. So if you're a Canadian manufacturer, Canadian BPM, if you're in a US BPM or a BPM anywhere else in the world who has really energy efficient products, how will the demand for those goods change? Does this create an opportunity, a silver lining, right? Because even though the overall situation in Europe is terrible, and the fates of many people have been changed for the worse here, there are things that companies can do to alleviate some of that, right? Through energy efficiencies, finding ways to better insulate, residences, commercial buildings, et cetera, right? Finding all of these, bringing to market, and just getting them in there too. It's part logistics as well, but figuring, how do we take this shift in demand and make the most of it for firms that, are designed to be, solving the problems of the world.
Mm-hmm. And so, in terms of construction, which is what we're all focused on in the first place, how can the recession affect construction adversely, and how is the industry and is it at all recession proof in some ways?
Yeah, well, what Michael is saying about the huge difference in energy prices between North America and Europe, that presents a tremendous opportunities in terms of building mega energy projects
Mm-hmm.
here, like in the areas of LNG and petrochemical plants and fertilizer plants and so on. The big question is whether or not governments will allow that to happen. And there's probably a more negative side to that in Canada than in the United States, which is unfortunate because Canada has so many reserves in energy. Canada should be taking advantage of that cost differential. In terms of construction overall, we've mentioned that residential is affected by the high interest rates and by the fact that the prices have run up so much. I mean, I just think of young people trying to enter the housing market. I don't know how they get in with $1 million houses and so on. If interest rates go up to 5% and it's $1 million house, you've got to have a pretty darn good starting job to be able to afford that. But
Mm-hmm.
where construction does have potential, and it's interesting because this has changed. This has changed over time. You used to talk about mega projects as being hugely important in Canada because it was often mega resource projects. But mega projects have become a big component of the US construction scene too. And it's mega projects that are things like giant computer chip making or wafer
Mm-hmm.
making plants, and it's LNG plants, and it's battery plants, and it's car plants to make the electronic vehicles that the auto sector knows that it's going to have to move to if it's going to meet its clean goals. And there's going to have to be money spent on expanding power capacity as well, because clearly everybody thinks that the answer to a greener environment is more electricity usage. So there's a great deal of industrial and engineering work to be undertaken, many of them really, really big projects. And even in our own start statistics, we've seen that over the last several months. Big computer chip making plant, big LNG project, and a big battery plant was in the latest monthly statistics.
Alec, if I look at those large project lists that you manage too, I think I see a lot of transportation in there as well.
Oh yeah,
which
huge.
is very interesting.
Yep.
You know, that civil engineering component is huge. And I think if I look at your top 50 project list for both Canada and the US, it's peppered pretty heavily with large transportation projects, which is really interesting, right? Because it brings in the question of, you know, well, what is the strength of federal spending, you know, both in Canada and the US, you know, when we have this rising interest rate environment, you know, and we've written a little bit about that, about how, you know, there's an interest debt component in the US, for example, 14 or so % of all tax revenue is needed to pay just to manage the interest on debt. Here in this country, in a rising rate environment, of course, that number will go from 14% to something considerably higher, possibly, which is going to take away from the funding of those or it doesn't take away, but it puts those projects at some risk, right? At some greater risk, unless, of course, the U.S. government, in its wisdom, decides to keep, you know, just adding more and more debt, which it seems to be really good at doing, maybe unfortunately. But those are some of the things that I think of when I look at those big projects, because they are very important. And transportation is vastly important. I think it's one of the great reasons why, you know, in the U.S. and in Canada and in other developed countries, you know, we do have the success we have. It's because people and goods and services can easily move about and get to the places where they are most valuable and most valued. So those transportation projects, you know, the value of them to the economy cannot be understated.
Yeah, well, it's the rapid transit projects, and also there's a lot of money that's expected to be put into rail, expanding the ability of rail to move. And what I'm waiting for and really looking forward to is when somebody starts up one of these giant hyperloop projects. I'm just waiting for a hyperloop project, and I want to get on it, and I want to try it to see how much fun that might be.
Yeah. If you can't buy a rocket ship ride to outer space, you could at least, you know, go Mach speed at ground level. That would also be
That's right.
Exactly.
Maybe a little more affordable.
Yeah.
Just
how neat is it to be able to say you rode the hyperloop?
That's right.
now, just to take things down a peg, because finally, economics is the dismal science. So I want to know, what are the worst case scenarios here? How can things get worse recession-wise in the U.S. and Canada?
and any number of ways. I mean,
yes.
I mean, really. And as I say, this winter is going to be really interesting because of the energy situation, because that's really, I think that an awful lot of this hinges on gasoline prices and natural gas prices and what goes on in Europe. And another one is China. I warn listeners that, or at least I say to listeners, be alert to what's going on in China, because China for the longest time had growth. Well, at one time it was 12%, 10%, and then it kind of came down to 6%. There's more problems. There's more things going on in China than there's some things that aren't so positive going on over there in terms of protests. A lot of people are protesting banks and the fact that houses aren't being built, and they're putting money into mortgages and so on, and they're not seeing the product. And then the whole real estate sector is in trouble. And the government's all standard response is to build infrastructure. That may not be the answer. They're building infrastructure that's maybe not warranted. And that's, you know, there's a reason that free market economies work, because stuff like that doesn't happen. Stuff like that gets punished, and it's not happens in China. And so, and China accounts for the commodity demand and commodity prices. So I'd keep an eye out there as well.
there's an infinite number of things that could go wrong, right? The question is really, what do we need to focus on that we can fix, right? And I think to some degree, maintaining or containing really this conflict in Ukraine is a big deal, right? Because of the way that it could severely shock the commodity markets, not just for energy, which is by far the biggest concern to Europe, but with the impact that it has on feeding the global population, right? And there are already plenty of reporters mentioning how food availability in Africa and other parts of the world is dwindling significantly because the grain that had been coming from Ukraine, and Ukraine is a huge exporter of cereals and grain, some other commodities of that nature. Without those exports, there are literally people starving around the world. So that's a terrible thing to have happening right now, because again, it's man-made. It's a man-made problem. Currencies is another one that's just incredible. As we said, the ability of U.S. firms to U.S. North American firms really to send energy efficient products to Europe. There's certainly a case to be made for that kind of stuff right now. The challenge is that the value of the euro has dropped tremendously. So we're having all of these exchange rate shifts and this volatility that could really, again, just further complicate the picture. So those are a few of the other, I would say, are smaller issues, or maybe some second-tier issues there. Not to say that starvation is ever a second-tier issue, but I think all I'm really trying to say is that Alex, I think, nailed the big ones, and I'm just hitting some of the others that might be a little more peripheral.
Okay. Alex, anything else?
No, well, the agricultural prices, because you don't think about the fact that energy costs go into fertilizers and transportation, like diesel fuel being way up. Goods have to be taken from wherever they're produced to market. And so higher diesel costs add to farming costs and so on. The agricultural side, yeah, that's something to also be pretty concerned about. And the war in Ukraine is certainly compounding that situation. They're really, it kind of kick-started it, and then there's all these ripple effects from it.
Well, to that point, Alec, food is a inelastic demand, and by that, what I'm saying, as Alec knows, is you're going to buy food. You have to buy food. You can't, change the fact that you need to eat every day in order to simply survive. And so the agricultural shocks caused by this conflict are involving something that is inelastic, something that we have to have. And so it only complicates the inflation picture, because that demand there's no substitute for food. There's other types of food that you can substitute, to eat. But in the end, right, you're really playing with life and death when you're messing around with the food markets. And so that's going to be just one of those things that we have to work out as well, just like we've said with energy. And energy and food are probably the two most fundamental components to any given person's well-being. And unfortunately, those are the two that are being most volatilely rocked in today's situation.
Okay, well, I promised I didn't on a down note, and I did. So thank you very much for joining us, Alex and Michael.
Yeah, that was great, Warren. Yep.
Yeah, thank you.